Hi, my name's Jerry, I'm a fantasy author, and in this new series of videos, I'm going to be moving a little bit away from giving specific advice about prose and talking more about the general subject of the reality of being an author. And the reason for this is because back when I used to be more actively involved in authors groups and forums, one pattern I noticed is that besides asking for feedback about their style or characters or plot, a lot of people were just looking for general guidance. How do you get started becoming a writer? What does it entail? And what does it mean in the grand scheme of things? Now, because of the overall nature of this general topic, some videos are going to be more practical, while others may be more like editorial think pieces, and perhaps none of them quite as thinky as this first one, where I asked the question, what is the responsibility of an author? Now, me being the hopelessly analytical kind of person that you might have already noticed that I am, I always like to start at the fundamentals, which in this case is asking the question, what even is responsibility? Well, if we just look at the etymology of the word, then it of course traces back to the Latin word response, which means answer. The basic idea being that after you do something, there might be some external authority figure who questions you about what you did and why. And if that happens, you need to be able to give answers that are both truthful and satisfactory. From this initial and quite literal interpretation of the word, we eventually got the idea of acting responsibly. That is to say, acting with the consideration that your choices might be interrogated later, and therefore anticipating the questions that the authority might have, as well as making conscious decisions so that you will be able to defend those choices if you need to. Now, a key factor about these definitions is that both of them assume the existence of some outside agents. That is to say, someone with the authority to question your choices, as well as the power to punish you if your answers are unsatisfactory. Eventually, though, as language kept evolving, we arrived at an even more abstract concept of responsibility, where the person doing the questioning is you yourself. You are the one who decides what standards you will be held to, as well as what the consequences are if that standard is not met. These two fundamental approaches can be summed up as extrinsic and intrinsic responsibility. And it's important to note that these evolved definitions didn't replace the old ones, but rather they continue to exist side by side. So if we're going to ask what is the responsibility of the author, then we have to consider both the extrinsic and the intrinsic ones. So, with that in mind, let's start with the more straightforward question of what are the extrinsic responsibilities of an author, which is asking the question, who are the authority figures who might hold you accountable? Well, I think we can agree that the most obvious extrinsic responsibility of an author is exactly the same as that of any other person, which is not to break the law, the consequences for which are getting sued or prosecuted. Now, at this point, I have to emphasize that I am not a lawyer, this is not legal advice, and also it can vary greatly from one jurisdiction to the next. However, typically the distinction is that lawsuits happen in civil court when a specific person or company goes to a judge and says, I don't like what that guy's doing, make him stop and apologize. Whereas prosecution happens in criminal court where the state itself takes you to a judge and says, what you're doing is bad for society and we're gonna make sure you don't do it again. A crucial difference is that civil lawsuits do not end in a verdict of guilty or innocent. Losing a lawsuit does not go on your criminal record, and you cannot be sentenced to jail. That all happens in criminal court, for which reason it's easy to see that prosecution is generally a much bigger deal and also vanishingly rare for authors. If an author gets prosecuted for their writing, at least in the developed world, that's the kind of thing that makes headlines, and it's usually not difficult to see why. Now, lawsuits, on the other hand, while also very, very rare, are nonetheless a somewhat more realistic concern. And in this case, the two main reasons why you might end up in civil court as a defendant are violation of intellectual property or unauthorized use of someone's likeness. The first one typically means trademark infringement, copyright infringement, or plagiarism, and the second one means libel. Now, besides keeping yourself out of court, you also have a variety of minor administrative responsibilities that fall in this realm. These include things like getting an ISBN, knowing when to request a new ISBN if the content or the format of your book changes, submitting example copies to your local national library if that's a thing where you live, and so on and so forth. Honestly, this entire topic is very deep and extensive and would very easily warrant its own video, if not series of videos, which I would love to do in the future. However, that would also require a lot more research, including getting an actual legal expert to proofread my script, so I'm not going to do that right now. Instead, I will simply state that your extrinsic responsibility as an author is to be aware of these legal categories and do your own research if you think one or more of them might apply to you. Besides obeying the law, there is another extrinsic responsibility, which I would describe as your commercial responsibility. The authority figure in this case is the market, and the consequences of your actions are your sales. You see, if we're going to talk about the reality of being a published author, there is one thing that you will repeatedly hear me say, which is that writing is an art, but publishing is a business. If you are the kind of person who just writes for the sake of writing, you can do whatever you want, write whatever you want, put it up on Wattpad or AO3 or your personal website, and as long as you meet your legal requirements, no one can tell you a doggone thing. However, the moment you put a price tag on your book, it becomes a commercial product, and that comes with its own set of rules and expectations. The gist of it is that if you're going to expect people to pay for your book, they're going to expect a certain level of baseline quality. And I have to emphasize that in this case, quality only refers to the surface level quality of the book as a product, meaning that it should have a cover that is not an eyesore, it should be properly formatted and edited, it should be free from typos, etc., etc. There is also the consideration of your price point. Your consumers will compare your product to other similar ones on the market, and if they feel like yours doesn't offer enough value for the price, they might look elsewhere. And then besides all of that, there's also the expectation that your book should deliver on its promise. What I mean by that is that when someone looks at the marketing of your book, the cover art, the blurb, and maybe the first couple of chapters, the impression they get from all those things should be consistent with the overall experience that your book delivers. If your blurb makes out your book to be a high-stakes action romp and the stakes turn out to be whether or not two people can talk out their feelings, that doesn't necessarily make your book bad, but it might not be what your readers expect, and therefore they'll feel disappointed that you didn't deliver what you promised. Hi, this is Jerry a few days later, and I'm just recording these little inserts because upon reviewing the original footage, I realized there were a couple of things I wanted to add. The commercial responsibility of delivering on your promise has two specific applications when you're writing a series. The first of these is that besides expecting that baseline level of quality, your readers will also expect consistency of content. Now, whether and how much a series should change as it goes on is a completely different discussion, but generally, readers will agree that the qualities which drew them to the series to begin with should be present throughout. To give a hyperbolic example, if the first three parts are all romantic action comedies and then part 4 takes a hard turn into psychological horror, your readers are probably not going to respond to it well, even if the book itself is immaculately written and some of the best writing you've ever done, because at that point, it's just not what they're expecting from that series. The second application is even more specific to series that are originally meant to be finite in length with one overarching story. Because in this case, that story, along with its conclusion, become part of your sales pitch. If you release a book and advertise it as the first one in a series of, I don't know, let's say 7, then it could essentially be argued that you're selling an incomplete product with the promise of delivering the future parts later. The readers who are following your series aren't just reading individual stories on their own merits, they are buying into the series as an investment with the assumption that it will eventually pay off in a cathartic and satisfying conclusion. And if you don't deliver that conclusion, they will hold you responsible for it. All right, so with those out of the way, let's now talk about intrinsic responsibility, which is, as we said, the standards that you as an author and as a person hold yourself to. Now, this is obviously a very subjective matter that everyone has a lot of opinions on. While I practice very healthy social distancing from TikTok drama, even I'm very much aware of the currently ongoing discourse around anti-intellectualism and declining standards, and I am definitely not here to make a judgment on that argument, but I would like to submit 2 quotes for your consideration. If you clicked this video, then you probably saw a thumbnail featuring 2 people besides myself, one of whom you most likely recognize and one of whom you most likely don't. This mystery person is Mickey Spillane, a very prolific novelist and comic book writer from the mid-20th century who was mostly active in the noir genre. Throughout his lifetime and his career, his body of work was overwhelmingly despised by critics. Even contemporaries like Raymond Chandler, who is one of the greats of classic noir literature, stated that Spillane's writing has almost no redeemable value whatsoever and is overall a negative to society. Mickey Spillane sold an estimated total of 150 million books in his lifetime. Perhaps the most infamous example of his commercial viability was in 1947, when he and his wife needed a down payment for a new mortgage, so he sat down and wrote a book in 19 days. That book, titled I, the Jury, would go on to sell a total of 6.5 million copies overall, and the initial sales were more than enough for that down payment. Now, when he was eventually asked about his notoriety in an interview, Spillane famously said, "People will always buy more peanuts than caviar." Now, whether you think this quote reflects humility or cynicism, I would nonetheless argue that there is merit to his self-awareness. Mickey Spillane knew that what he was creating wasn't art. It wasn't meant to be remembered and reflected upon. It was entertainment. Cheap, quick, and disposable. And on a fundamental level, I don't see anything wrong with that. However, there is another side to this, and for that, I would like to present the second quote. This one is from the 1995 comedy The Birdcage, which is essentially a modernized and Americanized reimagining of the original French movie La Cage aux Folles. Now, you don't actually need to know what either movie is about. All you need to know is that Robin Williams and Nathan Lane play a gay couple who own a drag bar. Williams' character is the manager as well as the director of the show, and Nathan Lane's character headlines as the drag queen Starina. Now, in one scene toward the end of the first act, the two of them are rehearsing their upcoming show number along with a young backup dancer who is just completely half-assing it, not really paying attention, and blowing chewing gum bubbles in Nathan Lane's face. The entire scene has absolutely nothing to do with the plot. It is solely an excuse for Williams and Lane to be funny, and they could have cut it entirely, but I'm glad they didn't. Because in the end, when Nathan Lane's character gets fed up with all the unprofessionalism, Williams goes up to the dancer, pulls him aside, and tells him this: "This may only be a drag show, but it still needs to be a good drag show, if possible, a great drag show." That singular line is my entire work ethic. Not just as an author, but in everything I do, because it simultaneously highlights the importance of being self-aware about what you're doing and its value in the grand scheme of things, but also the importance of holding yourself to the highest possible standard in that context. Much like Mickey Spillane, I don't sit down with the intention of creating art that will be remembered in the annals of history. I sit down to write entertainment, but I want it to be quality entertainment. So in my personal credo, the intrinsic responsibility of an author is to know the story that you want to tell and then write the best possible version of that story. Hi, it's me again. So in the original recording, I just ended the topic here because I felt like I had said everything I had to say. And while that is mostly true, I did want to jump in with some clarifications because I feel like my entire phrasing in that whole segment might lead you to believe that I'm being dismissive of anti-intellectualism or the discourse around it, or indeed the authors who hold themselves to different standards, whether they might be called higher or lower. And that is not the case. While it is demonstrable that the conversation around standards in popular literature is definitely nothing new, that does not mean it's also not valid. In fact, I would argue it'd be worse if we had no arguments about it, because the absence of discourse is never a sign that everything is so perfect we have nothing to argue about. It is always a sign of either complacency, indifference, or fear. The fact that TikTok arguments so easily devolve into pointing and name-calling is not a flaw of the argument itself. It is the outcome of having that argument on a platform that actively rewards incendiary behavior. So if we just take a step back and look at it from a distance, what this entire topic essentially boils down to is whether readers should be more discerning and demand higher artistic standards from authors. According to the proponents in the argument, in an ideal world, authors who produce little to no literary value would simply not be able to thrive because readers would just not be interested and not buy their books. And what this means in the context of this video is that they're essentially trying to shift the question of artistic merit from an intrinsic responsibility into an extrinsic commercial one. Now, as I said, I am not here to make a judgment on that. I have already spoken my piece. I'm just trying to offer this additional bit of context for your consideration. So, what do you think? Was any of that useful? Was there something I missed? Was there something I should have gone into in more detail? By all means, let me know in the comments, and until next time, stay tuned.